Thanks for that very kind introduction. It is really thrilling to be at Powell's, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. Sure. Is this better? Okay. Let me just move it down a little bit so I can see you while I'm speaking into the microphone. It's great to see so many familiar faces, including former colleagues and yoga classmates, and just, everybody who's anybody in my life is here tonight, and I really appreciate that. But it's also great to see so many new faces, and that means that there are people who don't know me who are interested in this really, I think, important topic. So I appreciate your being here. So as the familiar faces know, I'm a Portlander, and I researched and wrote The Body Toxic in a little office just across the street from Powell's. I walked by Powell's every day as I was working on this book, thinking that, if I can just finish this book, maybe one day I'll be reading at Powell's. And so this is the day. And I really want to thank everyone who supported and encouraged me along the way. And thank you. So tonight, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote The Body Toxic, and I'm going to read very briefly from it. Then I'm going to share some details about the hazardous chemistry of everyday things in our homes and offices. In my book, I focus on 5 hormone-mimicking or hormone-disrupting chemicals. Bisphenol A, which is the building block of polycarbonate plastic. You may have heard about this chemical recently because Canada banned it from baby bottles. And I think in Oregon we're going to be hearing more about it because I have a strong hunch that there may be some legislation introduced about bisphenol A in the upcoming session. And I write about perfluorinated chemicals, or PFCs, and these are chemicals that impart grease, oil, and water repelling qualities to food wrapping papers, fabrics, and nonstick pans. I write about flame retardants called polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs, and these are used in upholstered furniture and electronics. And then phthalates, which are a very versatile chemical that's in everything from PVC plastic to personal care products. And I also write about atrazine, which is a best-selling agricultural weed killer. So finally, what I will explain some simple changes I've made in my own life as a result of doing the research for The Body Toxic, and then I'll do my best to answer your questions. So before I do any of that, I was hoping to see a show of hands. I'm curious, how many of you eat microwave popcorn? Wow, this is not the average crowd. Okay, so there's only a few of you who are eating microwave popcorn, and maybe the few of you who are still eating microwave popcorn will decide that's something that you don't want to do after we're done here tonight. It's one of the things that I changed in my life after doing the research. So how did I get started on this path writing about toxic chemicals and everyday things? A few years ago, I was reading the New York Times, and I stumbled onto this article about some new work by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. And it said the CDC was tracking traces of chemical pollutants, including some chemicals used in everyday things, in the blood and urine of a representative sample of the population. So these kinds of measurements are called biomonitoring. And up until I heard about biomonitoring, I always thought of pollution as an external insult affecting the environment. But what the CDC was reporting and tracking, this idea, these chemical pollutants in people, it really brought home for me the concept that our bodies share the burden of pollution too. At the same time, the information gathered through biomonitoring raised some important questions that I thought, as a journalist, I might be able to answer. Should we be concerned about the effects of these pollutants on our health? Can everyday items be responsible for the chemicals inside us? Don't regulators already make sure we're safe from daily doses of hazardous substances? So I started digging, and I soon discovered some things that were for me, truly stunning. And I'm going to read a little bit about how I began to tell the story of what I found. The turnoff to the tiny hamlet of Bolinas is unmarked from California Highway 1 as it twists along Pacific Ocean headlands 1 hour north of San Francisco. Every time highway crews put up a sign pointing to Bolinas, the locals take it down. A building moratorium enacted in 1971 preserves Bolinas much as it was during its counterculture heyday, a colony of 1,560 artists, writers, healers, and activists, intent on safeguarding their bohemian community from commercial encroachment. While many mansions and new subdivisions dot nearby Stinson Beach, Bolinas still looks like it did when Richard Nixon was in the White House and Bill Clinton inhaled. Downtown boasts a grocery store with more free-range dogs loitering outside than patrons shopping inside, a restaurant that serves the freshest ingredients from nearby farms, and a gas station with a bed and breakfast above it. Victorian houses and weathered clapboard cottages rim the shore of Bolinas Lagoon, a haven for pelicans and a regular pit stop for migratory birds navigating the Pacific Flyway. Living costs have gone up in Bolinas, but local sensibilities and the pristine landscape have stayed the same. 20 years ago, Charles Patton discovered the town and fell in love with it. I used to come out to Bolinas and play music, said Patton, a pianist and singer who studied at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. That led to playing bluegrass and jazz for a living. She met her husband, Michael Lerner, in Bolinas. He founded and directs Commonweal, an alternative medicine think tank and cancer healing center that occupies a former RCA transmission site overlooking the Pacific in Bolinas, where the couple lives. Approaching the age of 60, Patton has the trim build and spirited glow of a woman who pays attention to diet and exercise. It's easy to eat organic at Bolinas, said Patton, who also takes advantage of miles of beaches right outside her door and nearby hiking trails that crisscross breathtaking vistas in Point Reyes National Seashore. She was raised on a Colorado ranch, and she likes to be outdoors. The bungalow she shares with her husband came with a spectacular garden. Patton enjoys tending the previous owner's legacy, adding more color and texture to the garden every year. She's always taken good care of herself, avoiding the pitfalls of drugs, booze, and tobacco that plagued others of her generation, especially fellow musicians. And it shows. She stands straight, which makes her look even taller than her 5'8". A short tousle of blonde hair frames blue eyes that twinkle in a wide, slightly lopsided smile. Patton displays the energy of a woman half her age as an activist on issues of health and the environment. In 2001 in Stockholm, as a leader of a network of 350 non-governmental organizations from around the world, Patton helped guide the UN's Persistent Organic Pollutants Treaty, which calls for the worldwide elimination of a dirty dozen list of chemical contaminants considered among the world's most hazardous. Intellectually, she understands as well as anyone the ubiquitous nature of chemical pollutants, but she didn't expect the emotional jolt she felt when she learned that her body was polluted with traces of 105 chemicals linked in animal studies to a list of devastating health effects, including cancer, disruption of the hormone system, birth deformities, and neurological impairments. I don't live next door to a refinery or an incinerator or some kind of factory, said Patton, whose blood and urine were screened for chemical pollutants after she volunteered for a study conducted by Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. I've been careful, and it hasn't made a bit of difference in terms of the chemicals that are in my body. It turns out that what's in Patton is in every one of us. Unlike our forebears, everyone, everywhere now carries a dizzying array of chemical contaminants, the byproducts of modern industry and innovation. These toxic substances accumulate in our fat, bones, blood, and organs, or pass through us in breast milk, urine, feces, sweat, semen, hair, and nails. Scientists studying pollutants in people, including researchers at the CDC, call the phenomenon chemical body burden. It's the consequence of womb-to-tomb exposures to substances so common in our daily lives that we never stop to consider them. That water-repellent jacket you're wearing, it got that way because of a chemical called perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, which is used to make the fluoropolymer membranes needed to impart the extra utility. As of this writing, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has asked manufacturers to voluntarily reduce emissions of PFOA, is debating whether to officially describe the substance as likely to cause carcinogenicity in humans. That cute yellow bath toy your child or grandchild loves to chew, it's likely to contain plasticizers known as phthalates, which are part of a large family of industrial chemicals linked to impaired sperm quality in animals. That TV you spend hours in front of, It's probably made with a neurotoxic chemical flame retardant known as polybrominated diphenyl ether, or PBDE, which is showing up in the breast milk of U.S. mothers at rates 100 times the average found in European studies. And the reason for this, as a quick aside, is that we've used so much more of it in the United States than anywhere else. In 2003, California followed the lead of the European Union and became the first state to ban 2 types of PBDEs. Other states have followed, but the most common type of PBDE, and the one found in televisions, is still in wide use. Scientists are worried that PBDEs disrupt the developing thyroid system and could cause developmental deficits. It's overwhelming what we're exposed to, said Jane Houlihan, Vice President of Research for the Environmental Working Group, a Washington, D.C.-based public advocacy organization that has partnered in several biomonitoring studies. Every day, we get a fresh flush of chemicals, said Houlihan. No place and no one is immune. The most persistent chemical contaminants are carried across oceans and continents by water and air. Like grasshoppers, they lift into the atmosphere, then glide back to Earth, moving from warmer climates to colder climates and settling thousands of miles from a contamination source. They're fat-soluble and they biomagnify, increasing in concentration as they move up the food chain. They cross the placenta, so babies receive their first exposures in the womb. Indisputably, chemicals have helped raise our living standard and make our lives easier and safer. Think of the conveniences of plastic food storage containers, stain-resistant carpeting, sleek personal computers, and fast-cooking microwaves. Think of the security of fire-resistant materials, clean water supplies, stronger than steel bulletproof vests, and nylon seat belts. Who can argue with the American Chemistry Council, a trade group that represents Dow, DuPont, and hundreds of other chemical companies, when it suggests in a new advertising campaign that chemicals are essential to life? The slogan speaks volumes about the importance of the $637 billion a year U.S. industry. It's not that chemicals are bad per se, and it would be preposterous for even the most ardent environmentalist to suggest such a notion. It's that costly societal problems often arise because we know so little about so many chemicals. And in the time it takes to learn what harm a substance is doing to people, to animals, to places, the genie is long out of the bottle. So what it comes down to is that the United States doesn't have a viable means to keep its 300 million citizens safe from newfound chemical hazards in the things that we use and buy every single day. The result of this policy failure is that chemicals known to interfere with the brain, body, and behaviors are freely used in everything from plastics, soaps, and toys to food wrappers, clothing, and carpeting. Children receive their first exposures to hazardous chemicals while they are developing in the womb because the placenta is no barrier. Every child born today comes preloaded with chemicals that may be contributing to various health problems that aren't apparent until later in life. And children receive doses through breast milk, the elixir of life. Hundreds of peer-reviewed studies show that traces of these endocrine-disrupting chemicals, which throw off the body's hormone system in various ways, cause lab animals to exhibit disorders and dysfunction that are on the rise in humans. The list is long and it's frightening. It includes cancers of the breast, testicles, and brain, lowered sperm counts, early puberty in girls, endometriosis and other defects of the female reproductive system, diabetes, obesity, attention deficit disorder, asthma, and autism. So going back to the CDC's biomonitoring work, the chemicals not only contaminate our air, water, and soil, but they're also inside us at levels that are uncomfortably close to the amounts that cause harmful effects in lab animals. I want to be really clear about something. My review of the research shows that scientists are demonstrating, through their lab work and animal studies, a correlation between the human problems I just mentioned and exposures to substances in such things as polycarbonate plastic, grease-resistant food wrappings, baby lotions, and the housings of TVs. Human epidemiological studies are beginning to confirm what scientists see in lab animals, but at this point, they cannot say there is a direct cause and effect. In my book, I introduce you to scientists and public health advocates around the world who are looking at the animal findings and urging new limits on human exposures because of their serious concerns. These are brilliant young scientists, such as Berkeley professor Tyrone Hayes, who was hired by Syngenta, the principal maker of the top-selling weed killer atrazine, to study the pesticide's effect on frogs. As I explain in my book, the chemical industry borrows from the public relations playbook of Big Tobacco to create public confusion and doubt over the findings of researchers such as Hayes. He discovered that as little as 1 part per billion of atrazine exposure is enough to sexually scramble frogs. In the US, it's okay to have 3 parts per billion of atrazine in drinking water. Atrazine is banned in the European Union, the corporate home of Syngenta, because it's detectable in groundwater, but it's still widely used in the United States. The European Union and Canada are taking the lead in exercising precautionary actions on chemicals such as these, based on a connect-the-dots method of identifying hazards. But this is not the case here in the United States. We have a system where the EPA tries to manage chemicals through legislation known as the Toxic Substances Control Act. This legislation was passed way back in 1976, and the idea was to regulate the worst chemicals before they got into the commercial pipeline. It's a really great goal, but it just never happened. First, the legislation gave the green light to 62,000 chemicals already in commerce when the act was passed. And second, where new chemicals are concerned, it didn't require manufacturers to test for toxicity or to measure exposure levels. So the EPA relies on not-so-reliable scientific models to predict the hazards of chemicals. The EPA was put on a short leash from another perspective, too. Whatever action the EPA takes to restrict chemicals can't create unnecessary barriers to business. In fact, the last time the EPA tried to regulate a substance was back in 1989. The substance was asbestos. The restrictions put in place by the EPA were overturned by a federal appeals court because the EPA had not met the test of risk-benefit balancing in applying its actions. The bottom line is that toxics regulations in the United States put company profits before consumer protection at great expense to public health. Evaluators from the National Academy of Sciences to the General Accountability Office to the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment have weighed in on the inadequacies of the system, but we're still stuck with it. So as the evidence rolls in about the hazards in everyday things, about all the EPA can do is negotiate with the chemical industry when it suspects a chemical of being a bad actor. And here's where the story comes back to microwave popcorn. The inside of a microwave popcorn bag is coated with a substance that, as a byproduct of production, results in a chemical known as PFOA. The coating is applied for grease protection, so after you pop the popcorn in the microwave, the oils don't come through the bag. PFOA and related perfluorinated chemicals that break down into it are used in the production of an enormous number of items for consumers. They're used to make nonstick coatings such as Teflon, stain-resistant applications for carpet and clothing, and they also work as a processing aid for making waterproof, breathable material such as Gore-Tex. They're used in plumber's tape and dental floss too. In fact, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, virtually every industry has applications for PFCs. These substances are very interesting to scientists and toxicologists because they have some truly eye-popping characteristics. First of all, they last forever in the environment. We've discovered some persistent, long-lived chemicals before, and we've banned or restricted them. In fact, the Persistent Organics Pollutant Treaty that Charles Patton worked on ushered in a worldwide ban. These are substances such as PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, the electrical insulators and coolants that we stopped manufacturing in the 70s because they build up in the environment and can cause harmful health effects. PCBs are still measured in the environment and in people because they are so slow to break down and because they're in our food web. I know this firsthand because PCBs were present in my blood when I had it screened for pollutants as part of my research. But PFCs, I would suggest, are a thing beyond PCBs because perfluorinated chemicals never break down. Every pound that's ever put into the environment will be there forever. And in people, they have a very long half-life, which means it takes years and years for a body to rid itself of PFCs assuming that we never have another exposure. In reality, we're exposed to more PFCs than our bodies can ever get rid of. And perfluorinated chemicals were another trace contaminant that I found when I had my blood screened as part of the research. So let's just step back for a moment to gauge what scientists know for sure about perfluorinated chemicals. They're in human blood, breast milk, and umbilical cord blood collected from the world over. They're in places you would expect to find them, like downstream from a manufacturing plant where they're made, and in places you wouldn't, like the Arctic, because of the way they move in air and water. They're ubiquitous in people and in the environment. And what are we doing about it? After considering the research on PFOA, the EPA's Science Advisory Panel recommended listing the substance as a likely cancer-causing agent in humans. The EPA received this recommendation in 2005. It is yet to act on it because it's still conducting a formal risk assessment. As you remember from a moment ago, the EPA has had little success regulating chemicals. So it has asked the chemical industry to phase out production of PFOA by 2015. Meanwhile, the FDA, which oversees food additives, is looking at the situation because of how these chemicals are used in food wrappings. And toxicologists are holding meetings trying to figure out if, as the animal studies now show, low-dose developmental exposures to the chemicals are somehow contributing to obesity. 2 preliminary epidemiological studies link low birth weight and body mass in newborn babies to very low levels of PFCs, and we're still being exposed to this stuff every day. As I write in my book, what FDA researchers found may make you think carefully about nuking that next bag of popcorn. Microwave popcorn bags contain a higher level of chemical coating than any other product, and they get extremely hot extremely fast. This may be why the concentration of chemicals migrating from the bags into the popcorn oil were hundreds of times higher than the amount of PFOA from heated nonstick cookware. In fact, based on the concentrations measured by the FDA scientists, consumption of 10 bags of microwave popcorn a year could contribute to about 20% of the average PFOA blood level found by the CDC. So it's really not the pans we should worry so much about, although they're a problem because they produce PFOA and it gets into the environment. But it's the paper, and it's the fact that these chemicals are migrating into the food and we're getting large doses from the coatings. So there are other substances we need to be concerned about too. In fact, I've got a whole list of them, which is why I'm not very much fun to sit next to at dinner parties these days. I'm sure many of you have heard about bisphenol A, or BPA, the building block of polycarbonate plastic that's used in sport water bottles and baby bottles. Just a few months ago, Canada banned polycarbonate plastic baby bottles because of the hazards of this chemical at everyday exposure levels. Nalgene and Camelback, the makers of brand name sport water bottles, have said they will no longer make their products using polycarbonate plastic. The makers of bisphenol A-free baby bottles can't produce them fast enough to fill demand in Canada or in the United States, where we haven't even banned it. And Walmart and other major retailers have said they will no longer sell certain polycarbonate plastic products. Consumers clearly don't want these things. So you may have heard just last month that the FDA came to the reassuring conclusion that bisphenol A is perfectly safe as used. But the FDA, in its recent safety assessment, and in earlier ones, as I point out in my book, relied on the findings of large industry-funded studies to declare that bisphenol A poses no problems. The FDA simply failed to consider the unique behavior of this estrogenic chemical at extremely low levels of exposure. In doing so, it dismissed the concerns of the world's leading BPA experts. Last year, 38 of them got together and published a consensus statement in a peer-reviewed journal called Reproductive Toxicology. In it, they said that 95% of us have blood levels of BPA within a range predicted to be biologically active. Not all of this BPA is coming from sport bottles and baby bottles. Bisphenol A is used in the material that lines most metal food cans. And the researchers warned that the adverse effects that they have seen in more than 150 lab studies are of great concern because of the potential for similar effects in humans. These are problems that correspond with recent trends in human diseases, including increases in breast and prostate cancer, increases in urogenital abnormalities in male babies, a decline in semen quality in men, early onset of puberty in girls, and metabolic disorders leading to diabetes and obesity, and behavioral problems such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So just last week, in the first primate study on the effects of bisphenol A, researchers at Yale reported that they saw an array of ill effects on brain function in monkeys exposed to levels of bisphenol A deemed safe by the EPA. So let's just say that the experts are only half right. Isn't that reason enough to get bisphenol A out of our products? But the FDA doesn't see it that way because it relies on a risk-based approach rather than one based on hazard identification. In other words, the FDA is betting the odds that BPA is not a problem, in spite of what the experts say, and in spite of a determination by the Federal National Toxicology Program that the possibility that BPA may alter human development cannot be dismissed. Occasionally, the realities about the hazards of endocrine-disrupting chemicals get through to our policymakers. This was the case recently about another family of chemicals I write about in The Body Toxic. They're called phthalates, and they're extremely versatile. They're used in toys, baby products, lotions, cosmetics, personal care products, fragrances, air fresheners, medical tubing and blood bags, PVC piping, pharmaceuticals, and car parts. They're ubiquitous in our daily environment and in people, including pregnant women and fetuses. Biomonitoring studies show that levels of exposure warrant concern. Humans are exposed to the same multiple phthalates and mixtures of phthalates that have cumulative effects in rats. In male lab rats developing in the womb, phthalates contribute to toxic effects of the reproductive system, including birth defects of the penis, infertility, and cancer. And there are reasons to suspect this phthalate syndrome in rats might provide some clues about the increases in human male reproductive abnormalities. Last month, Congress passed sweeping reforms to the Consumer Product Safety Act, which included new standards for toys. Part of this legislation calls for a ban on 6 kinds of phthalates. President Bush signed this into law. And it's a good start, but it does not call for banning phthalates in baby lotions and personal care products, which is another route of exposure. And as far as the FDA is concerned, phthalates are just fine. The FDA's legal authority over cosmetics and personal care products is different from drugs and medical devices. Cosmetics and personal care ingredients are not subject to pre-market approval, and the FDA isn't authorized to substantiate safety claims. As I talk about in my book, the FDA oversees $1 trillion a year of food, drug, medical devices, and cosmetics. But its own science advisory panel has concluded that it's suffering from serious deficiencies that put American lives at risk. Here's one example. I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to find out about the workings of the Office of Color and Cosmetics in the FDA. And this is the office that oversees the sale of $50 billion a year worth of personal care products. What I found out is pretty outrageous. The Office of Color and Cosmetics has 30 employees and a budget of $3.4 million. Here in Portland, the office that controls 989 traffic signals has 40 employees and a budget of $22 million. So you can see the low priority of this federal watchdog office. So before I wrap up and get to your questions, I want to tell you briefly about one more family of chemicals that we're exposed to through our everyday things. These are the flame retardants known as polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs. Structurally, they're very similar to PCBs, which I mentioned were banned in the 1970s. PBDEs were introduced in the 1970s, and they are very persistent, and they increase in concentration as they move up the food chain, just like PCBs. Beginning in the 70s, PBDEs were added to items such as drapes, carpeting, furniture, upholstery, and the plastic casings of electronics. Researchers began taking notice of them in the 1990s when they saw significant increases of PBDEs in human breast milk. And in the United States, the levels of PBDEs in breast milk are significantly higher than in other developed countries because, as I mentioned earlier, we've used more of them than any place else. The good news is the types of PBDEs used in drapes, carpeting, and upholstered furniture were voluntarily taken off the market in 2004 because of health and exposure concerns. But that is tempered by two facts. First, most of us have furniture and carpet and other big-ticket things in our homes and offices that date back well before 2004. And second, the most widely used PBDE flame retardant is still on the market for application in electronics. Several states have moved to ban all PBDEs because better alternatives are available. And you can find lists of products free from PBDEs by checking out resources online, such as the Green Guide and the Environmental Working Group. But in the meantime, there's preliminary work suggesting that PBDE exposure is contributing to an epidemic of hyperthyroidism in house cats who like to snuggle up next to nice warm electronics. Cats, just like children, like to spend a lot of time on the floor and have an abundance of mouthing behaviors that make them susceptible to ingesting dust and dirt loaded with PBDEs. The bottom line with respect to these flame retardants is that they may be the PCBs of the 21st century, and like other chemicals I've talked about tonight, we're exposed to them every day. There are proposals now before the state of California and the U.S. Congress that would greatly improve the status quo with respect to how we use and manage toxic chemicals in everyday things. These overhauls would safeguard our children and our grandchildren from the error of our ways. That's the big picture. But what about personal choices? We can't shop our way clear of this problem, but we can make more informed choices. Based on my own research, I've sworn off microwave popcorn, and I see that many of you already have too. I've thrown out all the plastic storage containers in the kitchen and learned to say no to optional stain and water-resistant treatments offered when I go out and buy big-ticket items such as carpeting and furniture. I've got a list of things in the back of my book that are some simple things that won't divorce you from the modern world, but they will help lessen your exposures and your children's exposures, which is really the key to this whole thing. So I thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to try to answer your questions.
You've been listening to journalist and author Nena Baker talking about her first book, The Body Toxic: How the Hazardous Chemistry of Everyday Things Threatens Our Health and Well-Being. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment from this presentation. Nena Baker has been a journalist for over 20 years, exposing the illegal disposal of toxic chemicals by retail jewelers, and writing about the deplorable conditions of workers producing shoes for the Nike Corporation in factories in Indonesia, to name only two examples of her previous investigative reporting. To find out more about Nena Baker, her work, and her latest book, please visit the Body Toxic website at www.thebodytoxic.com. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Nena Baker spoke at Powell's City of Books in downtown Portland on September 8, 2008.
And before I take the first question, I just want to say that on Saturday, October 11th, I'm going to be speaking at the second annual Healthy Living Fair put on by Rachel's Friends Breast Cancer Coalition. And it will be at the First United Methodist Church, Saturday, October 11th from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And the information is on my website, and you can pick up flyers also as you go out. So, questions?
The first question for Nena Baker was whether the chemical industry has responded to her book.
No. Not yet, anyway. Yeah. Excuse me? Oh, the question was, has the chemical industry responded to my book? And I said, no, not yet, anyway. There have been a few books out now that have looked at this problem from a number of different angles, and the chemical industry has sort of not really gone after any of them yet. I would imagine that at some point there will be some response to sort of this building, this crescendo that we're getting to about people being outraged about toxics in their everyday things. But so far, they've been very quiet about the specific books. Yes, sir.
The next member of the audience asked the author about what portion of toxicity was due to the role of carbon in these chemicals.
Well, I don't know if I know the answer to that. most of the most persistent chemicals that we've known about are, they're organic chemicals, and I'm not sure exactly what role carbon would play in the toxicity, but the problems that we've seen is that they're persistent. They don't break down in humans very quickly, and now we've sort of introduced a whole second generation of these things as well. So we have these legacy chemicals that we've tried to clean up, and now we're creating a whole new set of legacy chemicals. Yes. The question is, in the global economy, will the Canadian regulators and the EU regulators requiring different information, will that have an effect in the United States? And yes, it has had an effect in the United States in some instances, not in all instances though. Some of the larger manufacturers don't want to have two separate sets of product lines. So they've decided that they're going to everything they sell is going to conform to EU standards, but there are a lot of things that are produced in China and in other places where the manufacturers are just going to do whatever they can do to make their products efficiently and cheaply, and staying with the same course is the way that they have decided to go on that. So in those cases, you may see Chinese factories making things for the EU and then making other things for the United States.
The next question was about the new car smell. Is there any way to find out what chemicals cause the new car smell? Are there any efforts to regulate those chemicals? Would the author buy a new car knowing what she knows about these types of chemicals?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we actually leased a car a year ago, and although the car was probably not the style that I wanted, it's a Volvo station wagon. Volvo has, according to the latest studies, the least amount of chemicals in the interior of the car. So there is a group that has done 2 reports now, and I can't remember the name of the group, I'm sorry, but I know that if you Google phthalates and new car smell, you'll probably come up with 2 reports from this advocacy group. And it does talk about, it rates cars, as you're probably aware based on your question, in terms of the chemicals that are used and the chemicals that they've found when they've done some testing of the materials and I believe the air inside the car. Phthalates are in car interiors, and some of the smell is probably related to phthalates. Some of the smell is also from other volatile chemicals as well. And because car interiors get so hot, heat is really one of the things that causes the chemicals to unbind from whatever material that they're put in. And so the plasticizers will sort of, unbind and get into the air, as well as flame retardants. So I would encourage you, and I'm sorry I don't know the name of the advocacy group, but it is out there, and there is some good information about that. Yes.
The next audience member asked 2 questions. The first was about how the author would rate her experience on the program Coast to Coast. The second question was about the coatings on coffee cups used by businesses like Starbucks. How damaging are the chemicals used in the coatings on cups that we use to drink our coffee or tea?
Okay. Well, I'll take the second question first. I've been getting, in the speaking that I've been doing since the book came out, I've been getting a lot of questions about the paper. And the Starbucks question is the first about coffee, but I got a question the other night about the packaging, the cardboard packaging that some of, like Pacific Foods, for example, the soups and spaghetti sauces, and somebody had a question about, are those coated with PFCs? And because, ostensibly these are healthier organic products. And I know that in the case of cans, some of the organic canned vegetables are lined with bisphenol A. So this is a long answer to your question, but I've put out a bunch of queries in the past several days, and I'm trying to get the answers from several manufacturers, and I will ask Starbucks what they're doing with their paper. But it's likely that it is coated with perfluorinated substance. That is sort of the industry standard. And unless Starbucks is enlightened and wanted to move away from this because they were afraid of a liability issue, like the reason they put the careful, this coffee is hot stamp on the coffee cup. I'm not sure they would have moved away from it unless they were pushed. Yes, sir.
The next audience member observed that aside from some educated consumers, this problem seems pretty hopeless. The business community isn't likely to change. What is your overall outlook for responding to this health risk in our community?
When I started working on this book 4 years ago or so, it was pretty grim. I would talk to other fellow journalists, and I would talk to, I think that there's been a huge growing awareness of toxics in consumer products, and as a result of the awareness, there's a lot of chatter on blogs, and there's a lot of sort of grassroots campaigning that has led to some significant changes that no one would have dreamed of 4 years ago, no one working on these issues would have dreamed of 4 years ago. The phthalates ban by Congress, in toys, that's huge. Congress has not acted in a precautionary way like that, maybe ever. That action was based on animal studies. It wasn't based on a risk assessment by the FDA or the EPA. So that's a really big change. States are moving to ban individual substances, and that's kind of a hard way to go. But the fact that states are being so aggressive, and that there are so many of them now that have addressed PBDEs and bisphenol A, and California just passed a ban on perfluorinated coatings in food. I don't know if the governor is going to sign it in California, but it did pass in the waning days of the legislature a couple weeks ago. So, yeah, it's a big problem, and it's going to require some big changes, but it's not impossible. The European Union spent years going through the process of revamping how they were going to handle chemicals in commerce, and Canada has prioritized 500 chemicals, and they're going through the list, and that's the reason that bisphenol A was banned in baby bottles. And it may not move as fast as we want it to, but it is moving. And that is the difference between now and 4 years ago. So I consider that significant. And I'm hopeful that that we're going to see continued change and an acceleration in the pace of the change. Yes.
The next audience member said that she had given up Ziploc bags several years ago, but recently decided to buy some for a backpacking trip. The question is that it is very difficult for a consumer to find alternatives to these kinds of conveniences. If we're having to give up microwave popcorn, Teflon, plastics, canned goods, it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Pretty soon you're just living off the grid entirely. Yeah. It's a dilemma, and consumers need more information, and I think that regulators, we'd like to think that maybe our tax dollars would go to helping the agencies that are supposed to be sort of safeguarding the citizens, that they would be the ones compiling lists or requiring better labeling and dealing with preventing chemicals that cause problems at very low levels of exposure from ever getting into products in the first place. So there are no easy answers, but as I was just telling this gentleman a moment ago, I do think that we're making steps in the right direction. And in the meantime, I think we do have to go to those lists that EWG and the Green Guide, Environmental Working Group and the Green Guide, and other organizations, have really filled the void and are providing this information, and we just have to do our best. I mean, you can't. I guess it depends. Some of us have to make choices based on where we are in our lives, and do we have children? Are we thinking of becoming pregnant? All of that stuff, and I've tried to limit my exposures to bisphenol A, but I'm not a person who's going to have a child, and I'm not feeding any small children in my house. So I still drink from the big polycarbonate 5-gallon jugs that are on top of the cooler. And because that's the best and easiest and most efficient and I think, least polluting way for me to get that kind of water that I need in my office. I can't get it out of the pipes there. So I made that choice. I am going to use this product that I know contains some bisphenol A because based on what I know, it's okay for me to do that. I'm going to limit the other bisphenol A exposures as much as I can, but it's a trade-off. Yes?
The next audience member asked if the author had retested her blood after making lifestyle changes. And is that information confidential?
I haven't had my blood retested, and I'm not sure that I will. I've had a conversation with my physician about the results, and, it's not information that's really useful to him in helping me figure out should I not be taking a certain medication because it may have an effect on an organ that this specific chemical also targets, or I did it to sort of help me frame the idea of pollution in people in my own mind, and to help me kind of write about it in some sort of meaningful way. But I'm not planning on going back to it. I did find though that I am curious about something, and maybe it's expensive, so maybe if the book does well, I'll go back and have my blood tested. But this perfluorinated chemical, I was sort of an outlier on one of the perfluorinated chemicals, so I was way above the average for women my age in this PFOS chemical. And the scientists who helped me go through my results asked me a long list of questions about, how I lived my life and things in my home, and we couldn't really figure out maybe where the exposure had come from. And then I realized that in high school and in college I had sold shoes part-time, and that at the store what we did back in those days was, you sprayed the shoes with water repellent. So I've probably sprayed hundreds of shoes and walked through, hundreds of other clouds of spray. And this particular chemical is the one that's so long-lived that, the reason that I had a higher level may be the result of exposures from, 30 years ago or more. And so, yeah, I'm curious, but we'll just have to see. Yes?
The next question was about how the book had been received in the broader public.
Well, it got a really great review in the Washington Post yesterday. I've been on a number of talk shows, Coast to Coast being one of them. People are really interested in this topic. I think that, there is, it's a topic that's really important, that affects everyone, and yet newspapers and magazines haven't really covered it that well because it sort of falls in the seams between environmental coverage and health coverage and political coverage, and so they're hungry for information. And just like the question over here, the onus is really on the consumer to go out and get the information because it's not on the labels, and there isn't any toxicity data on these thousands of chemicals that have been in commerce so long. And so I'm hoping that this is sort of that I've synthesized a lot of information for people that will be helpful to them and also help them think about change in a big picture way. Yes.
The next question for the author asked her to identify 2 or 3 items for action at the local and national level. What would be your priorities for addressing these concerns?
I would support whatever comes up in the legislature this year about bisphenol A and other chemicals that I've talked about here tonight. But also, I think California has set a really interesting example with the Green Chemistry Initiative legislation that was just passed, in which I think the governor is going to be inclined to sign. And what it does, I mentioned it very briefly as I was closing my remarks. It lays out kind of a new framework. It's kind of a mini, REACH, which is the acronym for the European Union's chemicals policy, and it will, allow a state agency for the first time to get involved in being able to demand new data, and will also provide incentives to, innovating new benign substances that can be used as alternatives, and so. I think there's enough evidence to warrant acting on a number of chemicals, and certainly the ones in my book, immediately. But in a bigger picture way, if California and a number of other states are moving on a new approach to chemicals, it will really push the federal action quicker. And there is something out there called the Kids Safe Chemical Act. And it's pretty interesting. I'd encourage everybody to kind of look that up online. That is really the starting point for this conversation at the federal level. Yes?
The next question from the audience asked if there was a way of reusing plastic, for example, reusing Ziploc bags, that would result in reducing one's personal exposure to these dangerous chemicals.
I don't know. The question was, if you reuse a Ziploc over time, are you reducing your exposure because it's all out there in the initial usage? And I don't know, but I do know that with bisphenol A products, the polycarbonate products, using them and washing them in the dishwasher or heating them in a microwave, all of that results in greater releases because the plasticizers are actually leaching as the product wears and starts to degrade.
And we get it back in our water and our air then, right?
Yeah. Yes.
The next audience member observed that autism is now occurring at a rate of 1 in 150 infants. Doesn't that constitute an emergency health concern?
I do think it's an emergency, and I also think that the correlation between these chemicals and autism is something that it's still a really tough argument. It's no direct cause and effect that anyone can demonstrate right now, and industry does fight very hard when someone tries to argue that the increases we see in autism and obesity and this whole suite of things that I talked about. That it's a result or compounded by chemicals. So autism is an enormous problem, and I think the smartest people who are doing the research have a lot of concerns about autism and its correlation to a number of these chemicals that I talked about tonight. It's just a really tough argument, though. Yes.
The next audience member asked about the researchers mentioned earlier by the author, the researchers who were involved in animal studies. Were they enthusiastic about your interest in their research, or were they reluctant to talk to you? What was their reaction to your research for the book?
It was kind of mixed. I mean, Tyrone Hayes, the guy that I mentioned from Berkeley, he's tenured, and it makes a big difference when you're tenured. He also is, passionate and wants to be outspoken and spends his free time traveling around the world to legislative bodies and giving this brilliant testimony about, his research. But I think he's the exception. There are a number of researchers who, because they're concerned about funding or because they're not tenured, are not as outspoken. There are also researchers in government agencies who wish they could be outspoken and can't be. So hopefully, we're moving into a new dawn, and it won't be such an anti-science atmosphere, at least for the federal employees going forward. But it was really a mixed bag. Yes, in the back.
The next audience member observed that one of the problems was the lack of education on different types of plastics that are available. Would the author endorse or recommend a guide that would identify plastics on the basis of their relative safety or danger? One example is that Glad wrap is made of polyethylene. It doesn't have phthalates in it. It doesn't work as well because it doesn't have plasticizers in it. Another guide might be the recycling code on the plastic, the number that tells you what kind of plastic it is, so that you can tell how to recycle it. This audience member thought that 2, 3, and 5 were relatively safe plastics, were more inert, and did not break down as easily. Would you endorse that approach to reducing your exposure and risk?
Well, I think, what you said about saran wrap, if you're really interested, and I think everybody in this room is, it's worth checking out the website of whatever product you use to find out a little bit about what they're using. And there are manufacturers that have moved to safer substances, and I believe saran wrap is one of them, and that's why it's not as crinkly, or it is too crinkly.
I think Glad is the one.
Oh, Glad is the one.
It's a yellow box.
Okay. But as far as using the recycling, pyramid, the problem with that is that, at least for the number 7, which is bisphenol A, all bisphenol A is number 7, but not all number 7 is bisphenol A. So some of the alternatives to bisphenol A, the new stuff made by Nalgene and Camelback, it's going to say number 7 because it's sort of an all-encompassing. Number 7 is like all other plastics. So you can, as sort of a general rule, but it's not always going to, at least where the number 7s are concerned, give you the full picture. Yes?
The next audience member asked about the argument that has been heard in recent years in response to the kinds of concerns raised by the author in her book. The argument regards the ban on DDT, the insecticide DDT. It is argued that the ban on this insecticide has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people from malaria because, it is alleged, DDT has been used so effectively in mosquito abatement programs worldwide. Its banning decreased the effectiveness of those abatement programs. The same sort of argument can be made about permethrin and other chemicals that are used in the fight against malaria. How do you approach this kind of argument in terms of the debate over the use of these types of chemicals?
Well, I think the DDT example is a tough one, and there probably are places where it would be very difficult to argue the DDT isn't doing something great. But in the larger scheme of things, I think the argument has to be that there are alternatives that and there will be, and there are more in the pipeline that are greener, that are benign. That the whole idea of green chemistry is sort of first do no harm, and chemists had not ever thought that way. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but they don't take toxicology. They're not, they're just taught to, come up with this cool, innovative stuff, and they didn't really think about, what the results were going to be down the road. And so there are some, really smart chemists, Paul Warner and Warner and Anastas, the fathers of green chemistry. They have a couple of books that are really brilliant, and there are new programs coming up in chemistry departments all over the country. And in fact, we have one here in Oregon, I believe, at Oregon State, that are really, really pushing and developing, safer substances and a different kind of mindset about what chemists do. Yes.
The next audience member pointed out that one of the scientists that the author had mentioned, Dr. Tyrone Hayes, has done a lot of good research on malaria and has shown that DDT has not been that effective in the efforts to eradicate the disease, and that the view that it is effective is basically industry hype. There's not much truth to it. This member of the audience went on to ask about the cost of testing that measures the levels of these chemicals in our bodies. What does this kind of chemical blood testing cost?
Well, it's expensive. My blood was screened for about a little more than 36, I think, substances, and it was $2,000. And I was able to tag on to a much bigger study that an advocacy group in the European Union was doing. So I think it would have been really difficult for me to just, find a lab that was capable of doing the work had I not been able to, hook on to this larger study samples that were being sent off to this lab in Britain. So again, it's maybe someday biomonitoring will be used to help family physicians come up with, more information and better advice for their patients, but we're a long ways from that. And what biomonitoring does right now is it really helps researchers identify, what has worked. If you're looking for a substance that has been a problem, like PCB and DDT, and lead, we now know through biomonitoring that the steps we've taken to reduce exposure levels has been working. And it also helps to, show clusters of exposures, certain areas, geographic areas. And it also helps identify where the research really needs to be done. I mean, if everybody, has blood that's tainted with phthalates and PFCs and PBDEs, we need to be doing research on the effects right now. So that's what it's really used for at the moment. Yes?
The next question for the author asked whether there are any local activist groups or individuals who are working on solutions to these health risks.
Well, yeah, there's the Oregon Environmental Council, there's Rachel's Friends, and there's is it the Oregon, well, Lisa, you might know the answers to this.
One member of the audience mentioned the Oregon Toxics Alliance and the Oregon Center for Environmental Health as groups that were working on these issues.
Yeah. Did you get all of those acronyms? Yeah. Yes, sir.
The next question for the author asked whether she had discovered any ways of removing these toxic chemicals from our bodies, or ways of reducing the risk or health impact of these chemicals after they are present in our bodies.
Yeah, I get this question every time, and I didn't research the detox aspect of it, and I'm just not qualified to comment on that at all. But certainly there are a lot of products out there, and so maybe it's my next book. I don't know. I thank everybody for coming and for being such a great audience and having such great questions. Thanks a lot.
You've been listening to journalist and author Nena Baker talking about her first book, The Body Toxic: How the Hazardous Chemistry of Everyday Things Threatens Our Health and Well-Being. To find out more about Nena Baker, her work, and her latest book, please visit the Body Toxic website at www.thebodytoxic.com. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free, on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.
Local sensibilities and the pristine landscape have stayed the same. 20 years ago, Charles Patton discovered the town and fell in love with it. I used to come out to Bolinas and play music, said Patton, a pianist and singer who studied at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. That led to playing bluegrass and jazz for a living. She met her husband, Michael Lerner, in Bolinas. He founded and directs Commonweal, an alternative medicine think tank and cancer healing center that occupies a former RCA transmission site overlooking the Pacific in Bolinas, where the couple lives. Approaching the age of 60, Patton has the trim build and spirited glow of a woman who pays attention to diet and exercise. "It's easy to eat organic at Bolinas," said Patton, who also takes advantage of miles of beaches right outside her door and nearby hiking trails that crisscross breathtaking vistas in Point Reyes National Seashore. She was raised on a Colorado ranch, and she likes to be outdoors. The bungalow she shares with her husband came with a spectacular garden. Patton enjoys tending the previous owner's legacy, adding more color and texture to the garden every year. She's always taken good care of herself, avoiding the pitfalls of drugs, booze, and tobacco that plagued others of her generation, especially fellow musicians. And it shows. She stands straight, which makes her look even taller than her 5'8". A short tousle of blonde hair frames blue eyes that twinkle in a wide, slightly lopsided smile. Patton displays the energy of a woman half her age as an activist on issues of health and the environment. In 2001 in Stockholm, as a leader of a network of 350 non-governmental organizations from around the world, Patton helped guide the UN's Persistent Organic Pollutants Treaty, which calls for the worldwide elimination of a dirty dozen list of chemical contaminants considered among the world's most hazardous. Intellectually, she understands as well as anyone the ubiquitous nature of chemical pollutants, but she didn't expect the emotional jolt she felt when she learned that her body was polluted with traces of 105 chemicals linked in animal studies to a list of devastating health effects, including cancer, disruption of the hormone system, birth deformities, and neurological impairments. "I don't live next door to a refinery or an incinerator or some kind of factory," said Patton, whose blood and urine were screened for chemical pollutants after she volunteered for a study conducted by Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. "I've been careful, and it hasn't made a bit of difference in terms of the chemicals that are in my body." It turns out that what's in Patton is in every one of us. Unlike our forebears, everyone, everywhere now carries a dizzying array of chemical contaminants, the byproducts of modern industry and innovation. These toxic substances accumulate in our fat, bones, blood, and organs, or pass through us in breast milk, urine, feces, sweat, semen, hair, and nails. Scientists studying pollutants in people, including researchers at the CDC, call the phenomenon chemical body burden. It's the consequence of womb-to-tomb exposures to substances so common in our daily lives that we never stop to consider them. That water-repellent jacket you're wearing, it got that way because of a chemical called perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, which is used to make the fluoropolymer membranes needed to impart the extra utility. As of this writing, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has asked manufacturers to voluntarily reduce emissions of PFOA, is debating whether to officially describe the substance as likely to cause carcinogenicity in humans. That cute yellow bath toy your child or grandchild loves to chew, it's likely to contain plasticizers known as phthalates, which are part of a large family of industrial chemicals linked to impaired sperm quality in animals. That TV you spend hours in front of, it's probably made with a neurotoxic chemical flame retardant known as polybrominated diphenyl ether, or PBDE, which is showing up in the breast milk of U.S. mothers at rates 100 times the average found in European studies. And the reason for this, as a quick aside, is that we've used so much more of it in the United States than anywhere else. In 2000, so these kinds of measurements are called biomonitoring. And up until I heard about biomonitoring, I always thought of pollution as an external insult affecting the environment. But what the CDC was reporting and tracking, this idea, these chemical pollutants in people, it really brought home for me the concept that our bodies share the burden of pollution too. At the same time, the information gathered through biomonitoring raised some important questions that I thought, as a journalist, I might be able to answer. Should we be concerned about the effects of these pollutants on our health? Can everyday items be responsible for the chemicals inside us? Don't regulators already make sure we're safe from daily doses of hazardous substances? So I started digging, and I soon discovered some things that were for me, truly stunning. And I'm going to read a little bit about how I begin to tell the story of what I found. The turnoff to the tiny hamlet of Bolinas is unmarked from California Highway 1 as it twists along Pacific Ocean headlands 1 hour north of San Francisco. Every time highway crews put up a sign pointing to Bolinas, the locals take it down. A building moratorium enacted in 1971 preserves Bolinas much as it was during its counterculture heyday, a colony of 1,560 artists, writers, healers, and activists, intent on safeguarding their bohemian community from commercial encroachment. While mini mansions and new subdivisions dot nearby Stinson Beach, Bolinas still looks like it did when Richard Nixon was in the White House and Bill Clinton inhaled. Downtown boasts a grocery store with more free-range dogs loitering outside than patrons shopping inside, a restaurant that serves the freshest ingredients from nearby farms, and a gas station with a bed and breakfast above it. Victorian houses and weathered clapboard cottages rim the shore of Bolinas Lagoon, a haven for pelicans and a regular pit stop for migratory birds navigating the Pacific Flyway. Living costs have gone up in Bolinas, but thanks for that very kind introduction. It is really thrilling to be at Powell's, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. Sure. Is this better? Okay. Let me just move it down a little bit so I can see you while I'm speaking into the microphone. It's great to see so many familiar faces, including former colleagues and yoga classmates, and just, everybody who's anybody in my life is here tonight, and I really appreciate that. But it's also great to see so many new faces, and that means that there are people who don't know me who are interested in this really, I think, important topic. So I appreciate your being here. So as the familiar faces know, I'm a Portlander, and I researched and wrote The Body Toxic in a little office just across the street from Powell's. I walked by Powell's every day as I was working on this book, thinking that, if I can just finish this book, maybe one day I'll be reading at Powell's. And so this is the day. And I really want to thank everyone who supported and encouraged me along the way. And thank you. So tonight, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote The Body Toxic, and I'm going to read very briefly from it. Then I'm going to share some details about the hazardous chemistry of everyday things in our homes and offices. In my book, I focus on 5 hormone-mimicking or hormone-disrupting chemicals. Bisphenol A, which is the building block of polycarbonate plastic. You may have heard about this chemical recently because Canada banned it from baby bottles. And I think in Oregon we're going to be hearing more about it because I have a strong hunch that there may be some legislation introduced about bisphenol A in the upcoming session. And I write about perfluorinated chemicals, or PFCs, and these are chemicals that impart grease, oil, and water-repelling qualities to food wrapping papers, fabrics, and nonstick pans. I write about flame retardants called polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs, and these are used in upholstered furniture and electronics. And then phthalates, which are a very versatile chemical that's in everything from PVC plastic to personal care products. And I also write about atrazine, which is a best-selling agricultural weed killer. So finally, what I will explain some simple changes I've made in my own life as a result of doing the research for The Body Toxic, and then I'll do my best to answer your questions. So before I do any of that, I was hoping to see a show of hands. I'm curious, how many of you eat microwave popcorn? Wow, this is not the average crowd. Okay, so there's only a few of you who are eating microwave popcorn, and maybe the few of you who are still eating microwave popcorn will decide that's something that you don't want to do after we're done here tonight. It's one of the things that I changed in my life after doing the research. So how did I get started on this path writing about toxic chemicals in everyday things? A few years ago, I was reading the New York Times, and I stumbled onto this article about some new work by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. And it said the CDC was tracking traces of chemical pollutants, including some chemicals used in everyday things, in the blood and urine of a representative sample of the population.